We're all aware that the prison systems are not always helpful, not always ideal, and not always what they seem. We've really lost the plot at what prison is supposed to be, and before there were rules and regulations in place, a prison was seen as a petri dish. Not people, but lab rats to poke at and prod at. Today, we'll take a look at a prison and a scientist who saw their inmates as nothing more than acres of skin. Let's talk about what happened during the Holmesburg prison experiments. The Philadelphia Moynihan Prison was a prison designed by Thomas Walter in operation from 1835 to 1963. This prison saw notable inmates including Edgar Allan Poe, H. Holmes, Tom Hare, and Passmore Williamson. It was originally 3 separate facilities with an additional structure for females only and the debtor's wing. In 1896, the prison, like many others, began to see overcrowding, and Philadelphia started to build another prison to help alleviate the problem. Thus, the Holmesburg prison was born. It was more of a band-aid to the problem, as by 1928, this prison would start to experience overcrowding as well, resulting in riots. Holmesburg was originally focused on rehabilitation through the means of isolation, but they weren't too versed on how to do that safely. On August 20th, 1938, 23 inmates went on a hunger strike to protest the poor quality of the prison food. To rectify the situation, they were all placed in an isolation cell known as the Klondike. Due to the steam heat in the cells, these cells reached up to temperatures close to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. As a result, 4 of these inmates died. An investigation of these deaths led to the indictment of 10 prison officials, including the superintendent and prison warden. Security around the place wasn't too top-notch. Like something out of a movie, Willie Sutton, who was serving a life sentence for robbing a bank, managed to escape Holmesburg with the help of other prisoners by dressing as guards and climbing over the walls using a ladder. So, we have a decent amount of neglect, cruel punishment, and a lack of control on the inmates. It seemed like a perfect place for some unethical treatment to step in. Dr. Albert Kligman would take his first steps into Holmesburg prison and make the infamous statement, "All I saw before me were acres of skin." It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. Albert was a dermatologist who co-invented the acne medicine Retin A in 1969. In his life, he worked with 33 sponsors, including Johnson & Johnson, Dow Chemicals, and the U.S. Army. Now, the level of consent these inmates gave were not altogether ethical either. Experiments were offered anywhere between $30 and $800, which was exponentially higher than any other prison job you could get. With this money, some lesser bails could be paid off by the prisoners themselves, so getting paid was a potential way to get out sooner. What they weren't told was what these experiments would entail and just how dangerous they could get. So yes, consent was given, but under the guise of misinformation. So, what did these experiments include? Kligman's involvement with the prison came about when a case of athlete's foot broke out amongst the inmates, and the prison pharmacist found one of Kligman's University of Pennsylvania articles and reached out to him. He'd been a professor of dermatology at the university, and now he was being presented with a field of research potential. So of course he accepted. From this Acres of Skin statement, it's clear that Kligman was not a man of ethics. He stated, "I began to go to the prison regularly, although I had no authorization. It was years before the authorities knew I was conducting various studies on prisoner volunteers. Things were simpler then. Informed consent was unheard of. No one asked me what I was doing. It was a wonderful time." Kligman's experiments included figuring out different ways a foot could be infected with ringworm, forcing an inmate to wear boots for a week, infecting inmates' skin with various viruses like herpes simplex, warts, exposing inmates to long exposure of ultraviolet rays, exposing them to various yeasts to try to cause infections. Inmates were tested with foot powders, face creams, deodorants, toothpaste, liquid diets, and much more. One inmate, Edward Anthony, signed up for a Johnson & Johnson study that was testing to see if bubble baths were harmful to people with open wounds. The result was little red bumps all over his arms, legs, hands, and face, as well as gruesome blisters forming on his skin that would burst and seep pus. He'd quit the test early only to continue to feel like his back was on fire. The effects of some of the experiments lasted a lifetime, causing increased risk of skin cancer and various skin problems. Some ringworm here, some skin cancer there. Things couldn't get any worse, right? Kligman's experiments got even more controversial when he started introducing dioxin and Agent Orange into the mix. The Dow Chemical Company called for these tests and compensated Kligman $10,000 to carry them out. Inmates would receive doses of dioxin 468 times the company protocol. Agent Orange is a carcinogen and is linked to various cancers in the human body. So while inmates were trying to make a buck to earn their freedom, they were skyrocketing their risk of an early death. Even the patients who figured out what was going on weren't free of their torment. One inmate stated, "You lie there on your back, knowing you've got cancer in your arm, and you just think, boy, what do you think about?" Any patient who brought up cancer concerns would be told that it would spread slowly and surgically removed, like that was supposed to ease their fears. Then the US Army got in on the experiments and requested Kligman test some mind-altering drugs on the inmates, which was conducted on trailers on the prison grounds. These drugs would vary in effects, and inmates were compensated more if the effects lasted longer. Effects included temporary paralysis and long-term violent behavior. Half of the inmates reported having hallucinations for days. Getting knee-deep in the chemical weapon area of testing, Kligman was asked by the US military to test AE-3167, a chemical that was known for causing nerve and brain damage. Inmates were exposed to microwave radiation, sulfuric and carbonic acid, and like some kind of nightmare, had cadaver parts stitched to their backs to determine if fragments would grow back. A lot of the time, it seemed like Kligman was throwing ideas at the wall to see what would happen just for fun, and the inmates were never told what they were getting themselves into. Of the 1,200 inmates at Holmesburg, 80 to 90% were experimented on. While many prison officials and companies saw nothing wrong with these trials, something ultimately had to be done about them. Word would eventually reach the media about the unethical practices, and the public was less than cool about it. By 1973, hearings began to look at if it was still socially acceptable to conduct prison experiments, and with the public outcry, it was a resounding not anymore. Only then did the tests phase out in the US prison systems. Kligman's trials weren't even in line with the human trial guideline, known as the Nuremberg Code, which states that test subjects had to be aware of the true nature and the dangers of the chemicals they were being subjected to. In 2,298 men who had been incarcerated at Holmesburg came forward to build a lawsuit against the University of Pennsylvania, the City of Philadelphia, Johnson & Johnson, and the Dow Chemical Company. Unfortunately, in 2002, the case was dismissed because the statute of limitations had passed. In 2021, the University of Pennsylvania released a statement admitting that Kligman's experiments were terribly disrespectful and unethical. In addition to this apology, the school announced the termination of lectureship dedicated to Kligman and renamed one of the professorships named in his honor. So there's that. In 2022, Pennsylvania issued an official apology to the subjects of the experiments, with Mayor Jim Kenney stating that it took far too long to hear these words. Holmesburg closed down in 1995, over 40 years after these experiments took place. While the apologies are welcome to the victims, financial compensation has been described as elusive. These inmates were still people who deserved to know what they were being tricked into signing up for. The prison was just a field of skin for a mad scientist to use his toys on, in a time when permission wasn't exactly needed. The inmates stated they felt like they were less than human, and to Dr. Kligman, that's exactly what they were. Thanks for watching. For more true crime and horror, please consider subscribing. Game with me on Twitch, follow me on Twitter, and as always,